In the late 1980s, the British historian Richard Overy was involved in a historical dispute with Timothy Mason that played out mostly over the pages of the past and present journal over the reasons for the outbreak of the war in 1939 First World War. Mason had contended that a flight into war had been imposed on Hitler by a structural economic crisis which confronted Hitler with the choice of making difficult economic decisions or aggressions. Overy argued against Mason's thesis by maintaining that Germany was faced with economic problems in 1939, but the extent of those problems could not explain aggression against Poland, and the reasons for the outbreak of war were the choices made by the Nazi leadership. Mason had argued that the German working class was always against the Nazi dictatorship, that in the overheated German economy of the late 1930s, German workers could force employers to grant higher wages by leaving for other firms and so grant the desired wage increases, and that such a form of political resistance forced Hitler to go to war in 1939. Thus, in the outbreak of the war was caused by the structural economic problems a flight into war imposed by a domestic crisis. The key aspects of the crisis were, according to Mason, a shaky economic recovery that was threatened by a rearmament program that overwhelmed the economy and in which the regime's nationalist bluster limited its options. In that way, Mason articulated a primate there politic primacy of domestic politics in English view of the war's origins by the concept of social imperialism. Mason's primate there politic thesis was in marked contrast to the primate there open politic, the primacy of foreign politics, which is usually used to explain the war. Mason thought German foreign policy was driven by domestic political considerations and the launch the war in 1939 was best understood as a barbaric variant of the social imperialism. Mason argued Nazi Germany was always bent at some time upon a major war of expansion. However, Mason argued that the timing of such a war was determined by domestic political pressures, especially as related to a falling economy, and had nothing to do with what Hitler wanted. Mason believed that from 1936 to 1941, the state of the German economy, not Hitler's will or intentions, was the most important determinant on the German foreign policy decisions. Mason argued that the Nazi leaders were so deeply haunted by the November 1918 German Revolution that they were most unwilling to see any fall in working class living standards for fear of provoking a repetition of the revolution. Mason stated that by 1939, the overheating of the German economy caused by the rearmament, the failure of various rearmament plans produced by the shortages of the skilled workers, industrial unrest caused by the breakdown of German social policies, and the sharp drop in living standards for the German working class, forced Hitler into going to war at a time and a place that were not of his choosing. Mason contended that when faced with the deep socio-economic crisis, the Nazi leadership had decided to embark upon a ruthless foreign policy of smash and grab to seize territory in Eastern Europe that could be pitilessly plundered to support the living standards in Germany. Mason described German foreign policy as driven by an opportunist next victim syndrome after the Anschluss, in which the promiscuity of the aggressive intentions were nurtured by every successful foreign policy move. Mason's consideration he considered the decision to sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and to attack Poland despite the risk of a war against Britain and France to be the abandonment by Hitler of his foreign policy program outlined in Mein Kampf and to have been forced on him by his need to stop a collapsing German economy by seizing territory abroad to be plundered. For Overy, the problem with Mason's thesis was that it rested on the assumption that, in a way that was not shown by the records, information was passed on to Hitler about Germany's economic problems. Overy argued for a difference between economic pressures inducted and induced by the problems of the four-year plan and economic motives to seize raw materials, industry, and foreign reserves of neighboring states as a way of accelerating plan. Overy asserted that Mason downplayed the repressive German state's capacity to deal with domestic unhappiness. Finally, Overy argued that there is considerable evidence that Germany felt that it could master the economic problems of rearmament. As one civil servant put in January 1940, we have already mastered so many difficulties in the past that here too, if one or other raw material became extremely scarce, ways and means will always yet to be found to get out of a fix.